we realized it doesn't make any sense. And that's also one of the key learnings I had from my previous startups. If you're starting as a company, if you think you can solve an industry problem, you're doomed. It's not the job of a company, of a startup, to solve an industry problem. Even the big ones can't do it. Right? So if you kind of go out and say, hey, we solve the industry problem, I'm always a bit wary if this is really possible.
Hey everyone, today we're talking to Marc Beermann, the CEO of MOD, and we'll be exploring how they're building an open source prefab checker for construction projects. Marc, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. How are you guys?
All good, and we're
Doing
excited to
good.
have this conversation. Just to kick us off, with an intro, can you tell us what problem MOD is trying to solve and, how did you land on this problem?
Yeah, well, we looked at the market for prefab, right? And we realized there's a lot of activity going on. But if you look at the, let's say, the market share, or if you look at how big the sector is in total, it's tiny. It's tiny compared to, let's say, the overall construction market or the traditional construction market. And so, Yasha, when we started this company, we were asking ourselves, okay, what is the problem then? I mean, everybody agrees prefabrication, industrialized construction is the future. It's cheaper, it's faster, it's more sustainable. Everybody thinks it makes sense, right? Everybody tells me or tells us, oh, this is the future. And then still you're asking yourselves, I mean, all the stuff that's happening is already known, for many years. So why does it not take off, right? So what's blocking it? And we basically had a conversation then with, I think, 250 real estate developers, architects, and so on. Kind of when you're exploring and trying to discover opportunities. And there were a couple of issues that they always came back to, and they always said this is probably stopping them from using more prefab. One was that they just didn't have any experience. It's a new topic for many developers. They don't know how to start, they don't know how to integrate it into their projects. And the problem here is also that they're very much dependent on the architect and on the designers and on the engineers and on the GC. And if you kind of look at what their role is, they have different interests. I mean, the architect wants a design, he doesn't like procurement work. He doesn't like to limit him or herself with regards to the designs. And this is something that could potentially happen if you use more prefab. The GCs obviously don't have an interest to change the way they work, to change their special contractors that they work with, so they never, like the developers really never got the advice or never really were supported by their suppliers or by their service providers. So that was number one. The number two was that they just thought that the choice they have right now is just too limited, right? So what they said is either I go for all modular, 100% prefabricated. So I basically hand it over to a company, where we have a lot in the UK and obviously also in Europe and in the US, and they do everything. Or I basically do it traditionally. There was just very limited options to do it hybrid, so basically integrate prefabricated elements. And this is what they would like to see because that allows them to make smaller bets. Maybe start with a balcony or start with the inner walls, or maybe start, checking for the bathroom pots, for example. If you're looking at residential. And so this is kind of, right? So this is kind of what they were really looking for, and they said they hate this big decision, like they do 3 projects per year and then suddenly 1/3 of all their projects they do per year needs to be 100% modular, and they're completely dependent on another supplier which is doing the whole project. So that was the second. And the last one was, even if they decided to go for prefabricated solutions, even if they only integrate some of them, as I described before, they still don't know where are the suppliers, right? So they basically do a lot of Google research and ask their architect friends or whatever, do you know someone who could do this? And so that's where we realized, okay, we need to give the developer a tool which allows them to make these decisions earlier, right? And to make better decisions, and reduce the negative effects of this information asymmetry he has with the service providers he's working with, who will never give him kind of the real answer because they don't know, and also they don't have an interest, to actually make that work. So that's kind of the let's say the origin. And based on this, we basically thought, okay, what type of product do we need to build, in order to help these developers to make it work?
Just before we explore that a little further, you mentioned you talked to 250 architects, real estate developers, VCs. I mean, that's like an impressive number. But how did you go about doing that, and how long did you give yourself to get access to all these stakeholders to have that exploratory phase?
I mean, first of all, I started a company before which was in that space too, right? So it's not that kind of, I've never been exposed to this sector, right? So it's not that I wouldn't know anyone. I basically just started looking up names and try to call them. Also, we pivoted, right? We did we had another idea before, which we explored. And through this, we already met a lot of people as well, and yeah, so we kind of used our networks, we reached out to new people, went to conferences. I mean, there's a lot of hacks how you can actually get into an industry without knowing anyone, right? Or without really having any previous exposure or reputation in that space. And so we basically used our network. We tried to hack ourselves into conferences, to kind of be on stage, and that usually helps to kind of talk to people and so on. So this is basically how we got to that number.
Good tips for aspiring founders there. One thing I found very interesting was the open source nature of your business. Can you tell us a little bit more about the decision there? Why did you decide to go open source?
Yeah, well, we also looked at, I mean, when we did let's say, the exploration of that space, right? We talked to a lot of people also from the tech space, and we looked at also the companies that failed, right? I mean, of course, the biggest example we all know is Catera, right? But there are also a couple of them in the UK, as you know. There are also some players which are around now, right? And so we basically, through our network, we talked to a lot of people who kind of knew these companies and kind of, gave us more insight on what didn't work and what did maybe. And I think the open source idea really came when we realized that if you want to solve such a big problem in the second or third biggest industry on the globe, right, which is basically the largest asset stock. I mean, we're talking about, I don't know how big the asset stock is, right? But it's the biggest, right? So it's a huge opportunity. It's a huge industry, and it's very complex. It's very fragmented, right? And we realized that, if you try to kind of solve all the problems for this global industry, which is very granular as well. I mean, if you look at the building code, for example, it's not something that is universal for the globe, right? I mean, you're really going down to municipalities and so on. And we realized if we now want to kind of create a tool which helps developers to use more prefabricated elements in their projects and basically tap into the local supply chain, you would have to answer so many questions, right, about building code in Stuttgart or building code in Manchester, right? And all these rules you have there and all these things you have to consider, local logistics and so on. And so we realized if we would now create a software tool or the technology that you would need to integrate prefabricated elements into existing or into traditional construction projects, it's just no startup can do this. We realized it doesn't make any sense, and that's also one of the key learnings I had from my previous startups. If you're starting as a company, if you think you can solve an industry problem, you're doomed. It's not the job of a company, of a startup, to solve an industry problem. Even the big ones can't do it. So if you kind of go out and say, hey, we solve the industry problem, I'm always very, I'm a bit wary if this is really possible. And so we said, oh, we need to solve a company problem. So we need to solve the problem of a particular customer, of a particular company. And can we do this for all of these different developers around Europe and around the world? And we can't. It's just too complex. It's not possible to kind of build the software which can do all this. So we said, if we use open source, we basically allow anyone to work with us. We allow anyone to kind of take this and adjust it, so that, I don't know, if a French developer wants to work with our tool and it doesn't reflect certain parameters or certain criteria that the French building code or that the French in general need to have kind of in the software, let them do it themselves. I mean, they can work with it, strengthen the whole tech stack if you want, and then take it from there, So, and it's also very common now. If you look at AI business models, I think it's much more common now that you basically open, the open source algorithms and the everything at that layer really open source, and then rather kind of, keep, let's say, the training data, more advanced models that you use and so on as something that is your proprietary IP. And that's the way we do it. Does it
It's an
make sense?
interesting, yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting approach. And what you said there on not trying to solve the whole problem for the whole industry, but rather kind of solve a problem for a business and then grow organically from there.
Yeah.
I guess an obvious follow-up from that would be, given that it is open source, how do you plan to monetize that?
Yeah, no, I think and I have now, I mean, I told you guys that I'm in the fundraising process right now. And from companies that are, or let's say from investors that are used to invest in, software as a service business models, that's obviously one of the first questions you hear. I mean, so why do you share like core? Do you share the very value that you're creating now and you have created for the last year and so on? I think it's just, again, I think it's the only way you can really solve this, right? Is by creating something that everybody benefits from, that everybody can work with. I mean, we're kind of a marketplace. We're connecting two sides of a market, the developers who are building and the the fab manufacturers who basically deliver prefabricated pieces, elements into the project. So we are dependent on as many people using this as possible, and as many people. I think it's also an important aspect is that people should not be afraid that we basically just gather a lot of data, and gather a lot of know-how and build it into a software, and then it's ours, it's our IP, and we monetize it. And so that doesn't really work, and there are some examples in the BIM world, where you have these platforms which connect two sides, but it's more focused on a really like building, not elements at the layer where we are, but more kind of on really building material, screws and windows and all these things. But there are some platforms which are basically don't share what they're doing. They basically just suck all the drawings from all the suppliers, and then they basically provide it to designers, to architects, that they can actually use it when they create their, let's say, BIM model at a higher level of detail. Right? And what we heard is, and that's why we also, one of the reasons why we decided to make it open source, is that they said, I don't want to share my drawings, to this platform. They have it then. Let's assume this company, the whole company is then bought by, let's say, a Chinese player, or by, I don't know, someone. And suddenly all the drawings of all the products in the market, from windows to doors to piping, pumps, all that stuff you need, is suddenly, owned by someone else. The manufacturers don't like it. They just want to make sure that that they participate in the market, but that they're not kind of, that they basically share everything, and then the data is somewhere and eventually maybe going to some competitor or to someone who's not even here.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like that's also a very characteristic aspect of construction, that it's a low confidence industry generally. So I think if you're doing open source, I think you can totally get over that hump potentially. Another thing that we were thinking about, Harry and I, before this call, is that the cost of building software is just tending to zero now with these Gen AI solutions. So it almost feels instinctive, just make it open source, because the possibility of copycats is just higher and higher. But you have that way an ability to create community and following and loyalty. Was that ever something that came into the equation for you guys?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, if you look, I have a friend of mine who started a company which is basically doing a weather AI. They call it a large physics model, which is a pretty bold statement, right? They're basically creating the foundation model for the physical world, right? Starting with weather. He was very well funded by some really really large VCs who know the space very well. And he said that, like for our data scientists, to create the algorithm, the basic model in order to, kind of do the first iteration took him 3 days. Yeah. But what is like the point is that's not
That's not a moat.
that's just math. It's just
Yeah.
like a formula if you want, It's a model. It took them 3 days to do this because a lot of the stuff is also in research papers and they know this, and it's straightforward, What is expensive and what is difficult is then having access to the training data, having the compute to actually, run the model at as many data sets as possible, right? So that's kind of a differentiator. And so I think for us, it's a bit the same thing, I mean, we try to kind of, make this open source, allow everyone to contribute to it, make it better. Also like not being worried that we basically just suck, all the knowledge from the market and then just use it for ourselves. The key really is to train a model, to train it, to get training data and basically understand how it works, and then creating better models on top of this. And that's the key, right? I mean, with the deep sea, I think it was perfect. When we were talking to some investors and explaining the model that we're following, I think around that time was also when DeepSeek came out on the market, right? And they destroyed a lot of value with the kind of American players who have a proprietary setup. And I think that was a good proof. So we always use that example, say, hey, listen, DeepSeek, the algorithms are free. You can look it up, it's easy. You can run them. Of course, they will not deliver the same results, probably because you don't have enough training data. You don't have enough compute capacity to actually do this, but that's kind of how it works. For us, it was the best decision to go open source. It's so easy to talk to everyone. It's so easy to get people on board. It's so easy to get universities like Stanford, ETH, TU Munich, and so on board. It's so easy to get the community on board. All the people who are basically hacking in their free time when they come home on these topics because they're so passionate about it. I mean, to these people on board is so much easier because you just say, hey, we share everything. You can use it. You can do with it whatever you want with it. You can improve it, you can fork it to your own stack, build your own product on top of it, and so on. Of course, there's a risk that somebody would just take what we do and copy it one to one, and then basically just create the same thing as we do. But I mean, whatever you do, you have that risk anyway, right? Even if you do a proprietary system, there's probably someone out there doing something what you do. Yeah, and I don't think it makes a big difference. I think it's much more positive that we can actually get the industry to work with us and not being afraid that we steal something from them in a sense.
Makes sense. So from our understanding on your webpage, it's that you leverage the BIM model and the parametric data in the BIM model to then analyze it and say, okay, you have potentially X suppliers that can, provide a prefab solution. Is that like a fair kind of?
Yeah, exactly. So we start very early. We start with the developer. So the case we have right now is like developer who has a plot, who wants to build something, let's say an elderly home, and he gets the first draft of the design from the architect, and then he takes it, and basically we check it for its prefab potential. So we take it apart algorithmically and see, okay, this is inner walls, this is the bathroom, this is the ceiling, this is piping, this is whatever, facade element, balconies, and so on. And we take this and compare it to the capacity in the market, which is close by. So it needs to be close by because, I mean, there are some elements which you can also transport for longer distances, but the logistic question is important. Obviously, I mean, you will not deliver precast concrete elements for 800 miles. That doesn't make any sense. So you have to consider kind of the local capacity. You have to consider the price, you have to consider the delivery capabilities, and you have to consider CO2 footprint as well. And then we basically take it apart and give them a list and say, listen, for what you're looking for at this location, at this construction time, there are actually 3 or 4 players who could do this.
So just because I work in the BIM space, when I hear that, I think like the theory makes sense to me. It's just in practice that seems really hard. Let me give you some example. Like earlier in the construction phase, like the model tends to be preliminary, right, by its very nature. So maybe the architect has like drawn a wall, but they haven't gone and said this wall is actually 3 walls. They've just drawn a single wall for the sake of like easy and rapid representation. But that obviously makes a huge difference on the prefab check availability, right? Because 2x3 wall is different to a 2x10 wall. How do
Yeah.
you go and solve that? That seems a really hard problem to solve.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, it's really hard to solve if you want to do the work of the architect. If you want to replace the architect, that's really hard, right? But that's not what we're doing. We're just basically giving them a very quick answer on what they could do very early in the design process. And we basically take a wall. I mean, it's basically just a number of parameters at this stage, right? I mean, you have a dimension, you have load bearing, you have like heat insulation and so on. So it's very basic parameters. That's the language. That's the open source language, the MOD.DLM that we created. So that's at this level, that's basically where we operate. And the developers that we talk to and our customers now, they say, listen, I don't need the last, I don't need to know it all to the last detail. I just want to know. For me, it's enough to have an 80% solution. That's what they say, right? I need to know what suppliers are out there who could actually help us, using more prefabricated elements instead of, doing it in situ. And then we can start working with them, right? And we can look it up. And the architect has to do the work and integrate it. I know that from you, if we're coming from BIM or from the architectural design, it's hard to digest, but that's actually a very, very normal way of managing procurement and supply chains in almost any other industry. I mean, I've seen that in energy, I've seen that in fashion, I've seen that in electronics and so on. I mean, it's the technical term is design to source, so the design and the source work together early. So if you're creating a mobile phone, right? I mean, you need to know fast out of these thousands of, let's say, camera suppliers or screen suppliers or whatever, which are out there. You just want to know quickly who fits the parameters that you're kind of, designing for. And then you take this and then you have a discussion with them. I mean, it's not that you make all these decisions at this stage. Right? You just want to know who's out there, who can actually help me do this, who has, the right product, which has roughly the right parameters, fulfills the criteria, and then you have a conversation with them and you co-design to a certain level.
Right.
And that's
But
what
then,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. I was just wondering, but then aren't you why didn't you ever think of the marketplace solution? Because that almost seems like a marketplace problem, right? Finding out what is out there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that's what we do, right? We have 4,500 suppliers on the platform, right? So we know where they are, we know what they do, and we basically match it into the designs at a very early stage of the architect. And the cool thing is when you're really at this level, and if you're only looking at 20 parameters instead of drawings, so we're not looking at geometry, we're just looking at parameters. We're comparing 20 numbers, right, at the beginning, because that's already enough, to kind of understand if there's someone close by who could actually do this or not. And this is already enough at this stage, and that's the reason why it's so scalable, because we can do it globally right from the start, and it doesn't need a lot of work because it's purely parametric.
Within that, are you tracing the success stories on the supplier procurement side?
Sorry, what do you mean with success stories?
So where you've managed to say optimize something at the very early stage, you've matched up the casting device supplier, are you measuring all of those success stories today?
Yeah, I mean, we're still early in the process. We really started, our go-to-market was in January this year, so we're only out there for like 3 to 4 months now. But we're winning every week. We're winning new projects now, and a lot of them, which is very positive, are inbound. So we don't even have to do a lot of sales. So people read about it, and then they just basically call us and say, "Listen, I got this architect who was trying to do the research, and he basically, I don't trust him. He doesn't know that space. He doesn't know who's out there. So I just want to make sure that we really understand who's out there, that we really have a complete picture of the supply chain. And a lot of our customers are developers, as I said, and for them it's a tool to also reduce this information asymmetry that I mentioned earlier, so they just want to have their own source, the same way that architects work with certain suppliers very early or certain service providers very early to kind of find out, the eco certification, or they find out, there's so many people who are involved early that they ask, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? We're just another tool for them now to make sure that industrialized construction also works for their project.
So it's a nice, easy sanity check.
It's a nice, easy sanity check, and it's shallow. The idea is also to keep it shallow, right? It's not our job to do the architect's work. We want to give the architect and the developer information that they can use then to make better decisions early in the design process. Because as you guys know, if you want to use more industrialized construction, if you want to use more prefabricated elements, you need to make that decision in the design phase. It's too late once you got the permit. It's custom again, and then all the benefits of using that, let's say, a certain level of standardization in these elements and so on is gone.
Switching it up a bit, you mentioned that this is not your first company. How are you approaching funding this time, and what advice would you give to aspiring founders, given your experience funding companies?
Yeah, I think it's like I think the fifth company or so that I'm starting.
Wow.
Not all of them worked, obviously. I mean, sometimes you just start and just try, and then you realize it doesn't work. The last one was also in the real estate space. It was called All Things, still around. It's cash flow positive. It's working. At one point in time, I think when I left, we had like 120 people or so, so it was really growing nicely. Got some venture funding in there as well, from some larger European VC funds, and also in the meantime, after leaving All Things and starting this, I also helped some other startups to do the fundraising. So I've seen my fair share of these type of transactions in different market environments, and I think maybe to your funding question also, what I worked for a private equity fund for a while, which was also tech space. Also, we were doing more kind of 10 to 100 million, so a bit bigger, a bit larger deals. Typically also buyouts. So these companies were mostly profitable, and then we try to kind of get it to the next level. We did a couple of IPOs with some of the companies, more in the solar space. And so the good thing about this experience was that I know the other side really well, so I kind of know how it works within the fund, so like how's the decision process? How does it work when an investment manager picks up a topic and then has to, convince the partner and the investment committee to pick it up and so on. Yeah, so I think that really helped to kind of, understand when you kind of on the other side, what's going on over there, why you sometimes get these weird responses and you don't understand like why they're not getting any response, they're not calling us, they gave us this really weird reason why they can't do it, blah blah blah. So I've seen it from the other side as well, and so that really helps when you kind of navigate through the fundraising process, obviously. And I think one of the key things really that I see with a lot of founders, even with first-time founders, yes, absolutely, but also even some with some experience, is they think of venture transactions as they think of it as a transaction. They think I can just send like a business plan or a pitch deck to like this email address, and then 3 days later somebody calls me and wires me the money. That's kind of the mindset. A lot of them, really a lot of them have. It's really, really hard to get it out of them, when I coach them or when I support them in fundraising. That's not how it works, it's a relationship. You have to build it. And for the last company, when I think we raised like 20 million, in total, early stage funds. So I think the Series A was 14 million or something. It's not these people. I knew these people already. I had a relationship to many of them, or to enough of them, and a good enough relationship that they would actually call their friends and say, hey, listen, I got this great founder, great team, great topic, great company, great traction. Hey, look at this, right? I think it's really interesting, and then you basically have this, you can build in your next relationship, and you have kind of a common, you have some common friend, right? Where you basically have a relationship to. And what I always did is, in these management meetings, for example, when I went there with my co-founders, I think the first 10 minutes were just name dropping and kind of exchanging. You also went there. Yeah, I know this guy, blah, blah, blah. So kind of all these, establishing the fabric, so kind of really making sure that they understand we're kind of, we're not like some anonymous founder team from Switzerland, trying to find some money in London, but it's more like, okay, we're from the same community. So you have to take us serious, and we both know a lot of the same people. And that really helped, right? That really helped a lot. And the other guys were like, dude, we're spending 10 minutes on kind of name dropping and establishing kind of the common network. And said, yeah, but that's how it works, because that's important. Because even if they now say no now, next time I can call them and they remember me as someone with common friends. We even went to the same parties or whatever, like all these kind of things. That's really important. And so I think it's really, you have to consider fundraising as it's about relationships. It's about kind of who you know and who they know. And one of the answers you always get, in early stage, and also some of the companies that I'm supporting, what they always get is, you're too early, right? You're too early for us. And their interpretation of that answer is, you're too early in the sense of traction, or in the sense of, how do you say this, in the sense of, proof, product market, and all these things. But actually it's not true. It's too early in terms of relationship. We don't know you guys. So in order to prove that you're worth it, since we don't know you and we don't know your track record, you need to kind of prove it now with the company. So, the too early is not related to some hard criteria, revenue, whatever. It's only related to, we don't know you guys and you haven't proven yet that you're actually worth it, that we actually should consider this. And so it's too early. We need to kind of get to 100,000 revenue now. There's so many later stage funds who suddenly do these pre-seed funds, because they realize, man, this is such a big opportunity. They don't have anything yet. I know the guys. I know that they can do it. All these things. You remember the Pantheon AI transaction a couple of months ago, right? This was also a construction tech, design tech company from San Francisco. They didn't have anything, right? They were in stealth, and they raised 25 million from Andreessen Horowitz, pre-seed, pre-revenue. So everybody's looking at these examples and thinks, hey, they just probably sent a pitch deck. But if you look at the story also on the Andreessen Horowitz page, if it's still out there, it also says, the partner who did the investment said, I knew this guy for 20 years. I followed all the companies that he started before. And so it was obvious that, when he's doing something new, we'll give him the money. And this is how this works. So I can just, any founder out there who's starting this, never really think of this as a transaction, but think of this as building a relationship.
So do you think any founder out there that's building a venture backable business should, I don't know, spend 10% of their time building relationship with VCs?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's also the reason why, as a serial founder, when you do it for a long time, and if you do have a lot of attempts, of starting companies, and some of them might not work, and sometimes you do fundraising and still don't build the company because you just, want to test an idea and, go out there with a prototype or whatever. Yeah. So that definitely helps. So, but if you're a first time founder, I think the first thing you need to really change is your mindset, so it's not about chasing a VC at the Web Summit or a Slush, and trying to kind of do the 2-minute pitch. That's it's very hard to kind of be remembered, You have to do something which kind of sets you apart from all the others who do this. And so you have to really think about, how can I talk to these people? How can I use my existing network from university or from professional network, and how can I use this to kind of get warm introductions or to, get to these people somehow, And once you're kind of at a certain level, it's just gets so much easier, to also get really, really, really good introductions to some let's say investors, which are usually very hard to get to. So you have to invest in this, right? So you have to invest in the relationship, but you have to invest it with a mindset of investing into a relationship, into a friendship, or into a business partnership or whatever, rather than kind of just there's so many. It's amazing, right? There's so many lists out there. You can buy them or you can get them from other founders. It's like, hey, I got this list with like 100 VCs on it. You want to have it? It even has emails on it, and phone numbers, right? And everything. Yeah. Can you send it, please? That doesn't make any difference. Just because you have a number, it doesn't mean that this guy will invest in you or is more likely to invest in you, right? So that's not how it works.
Just going back to then the product, one last question on the product I had was you mentioned that your customer base is the real estate developer, but also you mentioned the architect, for example, because the architect is designing the product, but maybe the real estate developer then benefits from injecting prefabricated solutions to just ultimately drive better productivity on the job site, for example. But is this a little bit of a triangulation problem where your user and your customer are different? How do you get all of them to move in the same direction and adopt the solution?
Fair point. That's a fair point. And that's what we thought as well, because in the previous company, we had the situation which was not, well, at this point in time when we started, we didn't realize it. Of course, it's something that you really learn the hard way when as soon as you're in the market and realize, man, this is really hard, right, to actually solve this, because we had an even more complex setup because it was kind of a B2B2C. So we were selling to one group, the asset manager. The user was the property manager, and no, not the user. Yeah, but one user was a property manager, and then basically the user of a building, office or residential or whatever, he was basically the one which would drive up our kind of our usage KPIs. So without the person at the very end, the whole thing wouldn't work. But without the one in the middle, the property manager, it also wouldn't work, But the one who was actually buying it was the asset manager. So that really sucks, like as you can imagine, right? Because it's not the same person. So it's
Sure.
not somebody's buying something and then they force their team to use it because they spend a lot of money on it. It's not how it works. So we thought about this too here, and actually it's less of a problem than we thought, because the architect, that's also something that I realized, is that the architect is very much a service provider. It's like a consultant. And with the customers we work with now, they say, listen, I want this. I'll just, it will be in the contract with the architect. Listen, you got to use this. Gotta check the prefab potential of this, and you're using that tool. And then the architects are actually not that, it's not that they're so critical to what we do, because they realize also that we don't want to do their work. We just want to give them another tool where they can assess how to build it at the end of the day, and something that they usually wouldn't like to do themselves. We can just basically help them do very quickly, And we have a lot of architects now who also become customers because they say, hey, that's a great service towards my customer, which is the property developer. He actually thinks that's great. They think it's great, so that they can actually provide another service and provide different ideas on how to build the whole thing at the end. So it's less of a problem than we originally thought, Andrea, but I think the question is right. So far it works.
And you're seeing the same dynamic where the real estate developer is able to impose the installation method down to the installer?
Yeah, that's something we'll see.
Okay.
So far it works. We also have some GCs as customers. So yeah, we'll see how that works kind of at scale. But the developer also puts it into the tender. It's
Right, okay.
It's part of the program. There's no way out, really.
Okay. So
makes sense.
it's within the contractual prelims that they have to be using the tool in that way.
The tool, and then as soon as the developer says, hey, listen, I want to get the bathroom pots from here, and you have to make sure that it works, there will be discussions. I think one of the reasons why the developers likes our tool is because they're changing in German there's this word Preislastumkehr. I don't know what the proper English word is, but it basically means that instead of the developer asking the architect and the GC, hey, what can we do with regards to industrialized construction prefab? And then it depends on the GC and the architect, on the engineers, to kind of come up with ideas and solutions, which they usually don't like, and they don't have any experience, and it just makes it more complicated, more risk. It's difficult. It's changing the discussion completely, because now it's basically the developer who takes basically our, let's say, report, assume it's a PDF, so take a PDF, say, listen, these are the suppliers that I know who are close by, who have capacity, have an interesting product, and they could deliver, for this project, the inner walls, the balconies, and the facade elements. Can we use it? And then it's changing the discussion in the sense that the architect now has to argue against it, and the GC has to argue against it. And sometimes it could make sense, that it doesn't make sense to actually use prefabricated elements. But at least you're changing that discussion, and that's really the effect that we see, that suddenly the developer has a new source of information that no one else has, that he paid for. Then the others have to say, no, I can't use these balconies. And then they say, okay, why not? Yeah, it's because da 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 da. And then you very quickly realize, okay, it's just some made up argument, or if it's a substantial argument why it doesn't work technically, and that's completely okay, right? I mean, not everybody, not every solution will work, right? And that's the reason what the developers really like about this. They have a different discussion with their suppliers, and they're not forced to. I mean, they can still decide to go in situ and do the whole thing traditional if it's too complicated, or it takes too much time, or the suppliers that work with the GCs and the architects and so on are too complicated, or not, are too opposing that idea too strongly, so that they will not do it, so that's totally completely fine. So we really see it kind of as, something that over many generations of construction projects, they will kind of evolve. And
on that, you've got a kind of a wealth of contacts across the industry, and you also mentioned that some GCs are now starting to embrace the platform.
Right.
But it's always a harder sell on that side of things. What advice would you give to GCs on the construction companies looking to embrace digitization, innovation?
The GCs particularly, or?
Yeah, GCs particularly.
Okay. I think one of the big, if you assume that prefabrication, industrialized construction is here to stay, and for us and for many others out there, probably for you guys too, there's no alternative. We can't go on like this for like the next 100 years and then have the next round of discussions around, we could actually industrialize, we could actually use BIM and all these things. It just doesn't work. So, we have to do something. So the GCs we talk to, let's say at the top management level, they totally get it. They totally see it, so they're also investing in that space a lot. And what we heard now is that, the challenge will probably be, the challenge will probably be how do you integrate prefabricated elements and how do you assemble it on site? Also how do you mix it into traditional construction? And so this is kind of what we see where there's a challenge for them to build the capabilities, to build the skills, to build the teams who can actually integrate prefabricated elements and assemble them on site. So the whole on-site logistics part is becoming more important, obviously, but also the assembly and really building that competence, to do this. This is something I just heard 2 weeks ago. I said we need to kind of teach our people not to do kind of only, concrete, kind of the way we worked before, but being able to integrate, let's say, our in situ concrete wall, and mix it with this prefabricated ceiling system or roof system or whatever. So they need to have more competence with regards to mixing these things in. And they also realize that they have to do it anyway, because if they don't, they will probably have issues, because then the modular building where everything is from one source out of one building system, right, will replace them is the other alternative. So they realize, okay, in order to make sure that we really, stay on top of things, we need to be able to integrate these prefabricated elements. It could be bathroom pots, like how do we integrate them into our system? How does it work with logistics? Like where do they have to land? How do we get it in there? What does it change? What does it mean for our cranes? Right? What does it mean for the project management and so on and so forth? So these are the kind of discussions they have right now. But we are a tool, to help them also understand that better. The type of prefabricated elements will be dominant in the beginning. What is kind of the first thing that is probably be prefabricated? You see it with balconies, you see it with facade elements already, you see it with bathroom pots in certain projects. But what about if this scales? This now happens with every project, or let's say we get some new systems for inner walls as well, or for ceilings or whatever. So they're kind of thinking about this.
On that investment side, do you see it more on sort of the manufacturing, the hardware of it, or is it a more competent side from the general contractors? You mentioned that you're starting to see a lot more investment in the space.
You mean
from the GC side? Yeah.
I don't know what they're investing really, but what you see is that GCs are also integrating. They're moving downstream. They're building their own factories now as well.
Yeah.
Even from the developer side, they're moving downstream and kind of, basically creating these vertically integrated players. Greystar is an example. They built a very big modular factory, I think, in North Carolina. So there's a lot more of those kind of moving downstream, and also GCs doing it now. I mean, they've done it already for a couple of years with precast concrete. But now they're also building. The natural thing they do is they kind of create their own product, which is basically a complete modular kit of parts concept. And the interesting thing is that they also realize that this doesn't really work so well as all these vertically integrated players. It's very difficult. You have capacity, which you need to utilize to at least 70-80%, and then you have a very lumpy project supply chain demand curve, which makes it very difficult, right? So that's something that they realize as well, so even their own projects are not enough to fill the capacity of the factories that they have. So what we see there is also that the discussions we have with the GCs, that they're also considering opening up their capacity, their manufacturing capabilities to also deliver elements outside of their kit of parts, so that they make the capacity available on the market. And so that's something that we see with GCs as well.
That's interesting. You'll notice that trend because it's always been somewhat of a limiting factor for the whole prefab space is, you invest 200 million in a factory and you don't know if your projects are going to dry up. So it's an interesting concept of something to go to market.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right here. Like Yasha and I, we were really surprised, because we go to all these conferences and see all these innovative players and so on. It's the same playbook. It's always the same playbook. It's absolutely amazing. It's the Katera playbook. It's basically creating like a vertically integrated player. And if you look at some of the players, they even go so far that they create their own applications for the users of the building, to manage their life, including amenity services and so on. This is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they're they're buying plots, they're building the product, they're doing the whole thing, even all the way until the operations. And this just, I don't know why that happens all the time, but it doesn't make any sense, really. And I've seen this in other industries like renewable energy, for example, because the private equity fund I was working for, we invested in that sector mainly. And so I've seen these integrated players when they started, when an industry was young and immature and you didn't have the supply chain, you didn't have the capacity, that's the natural reaction. What you do, kind of say like, I don't know where to buy it from, so I just build it myself, right? I'd kind of create this integrated product, if you want, including, raw materials. So in wind energy, that was the case, right? So the first wind energy turbine manufacturers did the whole thing, right? Because there was no source where they could actually get these, these rotor blades, for example, or certain element like technical elements, they just couldn't buy it, right? So they basically built it themselves. And then as the industry matured, they took it apart, right? So they say like, it doesn't make sense to kind of do our own rotor blades, and just buy it on the market. And there will probably be some new players who are out there. And I thought that at construction we're a bit further, that people would understand it makes sense to organize supply chains, how they are organized in more mature industries. But it's still the same thing. They all start with a completely vertical integrated playbook. So they want to do everything themselves. And that's also the reason why open source is a new idea, right? Because they all say like, I'm not sharing this. This is my own kit of parts. I'm not sharing anything, like interfaces, how they're connected. I'm not sharing this with anyone because that's my proprietary IP. And we always tell them, listen, then when we talk to the developers, they don't care about all this. I mean, they want to have a building at the end, right, which performs. And they don't care if you have like this super new solution, how to kind of, create an interface. It would be much better if we all share this, and create like a common, I don't know, like a set of 10 different ways to create interface between walls and, and the ceiling, instead of everybody doing it by themselves, creating their own factories. And the other problem also with the factories is the factories are highly specific to, the assets are highly specific, to the building system that they've created. So you can't use it for anything else. So if you don't have enough orders, if you don't have enough demand for whatever reason, right, you basically have a factory sitting idle, because you can't use it for anything else, right? And so this really doesn't make any sense. I think it's just, I'm just wondering, like, why is it that the industry is kind of repeating the same playbook over and over again? They're all selling it as if it's really kind of the latest innovation, and they focus too much on kind of the tech, like, oh, we use we use robots to do this, right? Oh, we use 3D printing to do this, but at the end of the day, the developers, they don't care if it's done in the factory with robots or with manually or with 3D. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, That's not what I'm buying. And so the focus is way too much on this stuff. So I think it just doesn't make any sense, right? So I think the supply chain in prefabricated construction needs to grow up, right? They need to open up. They need to make their capacity available for other projects, for other developers, so that I can actually use your factory to get a wall, or to use the other factory to get a bathroom pot, which is maybe, not specific more to your product, but to mine, which I can then use. And this is how to actually make it work, and this is something that we are really surprised that this doesn't, is like a natural development. It's kind of this repetition of the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, and hopefully that
Harry,
changes.
Harry, you see this in the UK. I mean, there's so many who just went bankrupt, who invested 100 million, 200 million in a factory, and then 3 years later they're gone, right? And it's, we couldn't make it. Like the demand is very difficult. Say, like, you shouldn't wait for the demand to change, the demand curve pattern change. You should maybe change your setup, and maybe be able to sell your capacity and make it very easy to access the capacity that you have. Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen multiple examples of it, and I think as well, because profit margins, especially in the UK, seem to be so slim, it never is the right time to invest in that kind of heavy infrastructure for the system.
Right.
It's interesting that you're starting to see people go to market and diversify what this factory can produce.
Yeah.
We're approaching, I think, the end of the time. So just to conclude us, Marc, is there, anything else you want to share about MOD, or where people can find out about you?
Yeah, I mean, we have the MOD.Construction is the website. So if someone of your audience or within your audience is interested in what we do, reach out to us. I mean, we're really open as an open source company to collaborate, to try things out, to help, developers with finding the best solution for their project. So, happy to have as many conversations as possible to kind of get the whole market moving.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Marc.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, that was super interesting. Really appreciate it.